Sometimes I wonder if white folks don't feel that somehow they can't be left wing because the history of their tribe, white folks, is right wing. But that's not true. There's plenty of left wing history in the United States as well. Your heritage is left wing. For example, let's talk about William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania on the Quaker principles of compassion and tolerance. Penn saw his colony as a holy experiment in which Christians and Indians could live together in harmony. He referred to this ideal society as the peaceable kingdom and treated the Indians in his province with unusual respect and decency. And then there's founding father Ben Franklin, who did not believe that property was a natural right. In fact, he argued that, quote, property is a creature of society and is subject to the calls of that society whenever its necessities shall require it. He also said, an enormous proportion of property vested in a few individuals is dangerous to the rights and destructive of the common happiness of mankind. And therefore every free state hath a right by its laws to discourage the possession of such property. End quote. And if he had had his way, the national government would have been like the one he set up in Pennsylvania. It would have had no Senate and a plural executive or a president without veto power and without salary. Because Franklin felt that high salaries attached to public office corrupted the government and divided it from the people it was supposed to serve. And it was his conviction that, quote, in a democratical state, there ought to be no offices of profit, end quote. Also, he was a staunch opponent of slavery, signing many petitions arguing for the right of slaves for freedom. Well, and then there's Tom Paine, who wrote Common Sense, which was a short book that helped start a war for independence. Paine urged colonial settlers to create a government based on elected representation. He wrote in a plain style for workers and farmers because he saw the American Revolution as part of a worldwide movement for fairness for everybody. He wrote against slavery and poverty. And when France revolted against its king, Tom moved to France and was elected to the new government. Later, when his allies lost power, he was thrown in jail and almost executed. Tom wrote The Rights of Man to support the French Revolution. And 2 years later, he wrote The Age of Reason to argue that societies should be based on science and not on religion. Well, then there's people like Captain William Clark, who, along with Meriwether Lewis, led the Lewis and Clark Expedition Corps of Discovery that explored the continent. Lewis and Clark neither enslaved or pillaged the villages of the Native Americans that they met along the way. In fact, without the help of the Native Americans, they never would have survived. Native hospitality was both genuine and useful, and for their part, Lewis and Clark recognized the necessity of being friends with the Indians. And for most of the journey, there was mutual respect. And that respect and friendship left behind many Indians a legacy of nonviolent contact that was not respected by the people who followed later. Then you've got people like Henry David Thoreau, who, in 1846, refused to pay his Massachusetts poll tax because he was denouncing the Mexican War. And in protest, he wouldn't pay the tax and got jailed. His fellow writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, agreed but thought protest was futile. And he visited Thoreau in jail and asked him, "What are you doing in there?" And it's reported that Thoreau replied, "What are you doing out there?" And then there's also the abolitionists, people who were very much against slavery in the 1800s, like Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, or his fellow journalist, William Lloyd Garrison, who founded an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. Now, he was a staunch abolitionist who helped found the Anti-Slavery Society and stood for an immediate end to slavery and total equality for black people and for women. He was also against working with any of the major political parties because he thought that while some politicians might talk a good game, they did very little to end it. Then, of course, you got Abraham Lincoln, who eventually became totally against slavery and freed the slaves. Also, Lincoln really felt that no man should be the master of another, even in the workplace. And then you also have people who believed in equal rights for women, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was a strong believer that every woman should have the right to vote and to have any job for which she is qualified for. Throughout her life, she spoke publicly, wrote, and was an active promoter of women and blacks' rights. In 1848, she helped found the Women's Rights Convention that was held in Seneca Falls, New York. And, of course, there's also Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was pretty fearless and didn't back down from what she believed in. She helped to form a weekly journal on women's rights called The Revolution. The journal's motto was, "The true republic, men, their rights and nothing more, women, their rights and nothing less." And she helped found the National Women's Suffrage Association, and in 1872 was arrested for the crime of voting in the presidential election. She was convicted and fined $100 and announced, "I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty," and never did. Then there's the famous author Mark Twain, who once said, "I am always on the side of the revolutionists, because there never was a revolution unless there were some oppressive and intolerable conditions against which to revolt." He first worked as a printer's apprentice in East Coast cities in horrible conditions and without pay. And then he went back to the Midwest, where he started in the 1850s, and he had another miserable apprenticeship on riverboats. But eventually he became a journalist in San Francisco, publishing articles protesting the unfair treatment of Chinese immigrants, police brutality, and a legal system that favored the rich over the poor. He found fame and fortune writing books against the bad treatment of blacks like Huckleberry Finn, and he argued that African Americans should be compensated for the crime of enslavement. He was critical of U.S. social and economic inequalities at home and wars abroad, joining the Anti-Imperialist League and opposing the U.S. invasion of the Philippines. Now this woman here is Mother Jones. She worked as a seamstress in Chicago and was shocked by the suffering of the poor and how little the rich seemed to care. So she decided to dedicate her life to helping poor and working people. Many workers at the time were trying to form unions, but their employees did their best to prevent it. And she began traveling around the country, visiting workers who were on strike, joining their picket lines, and using humor and storytelling, speaking to large crowds to keep their spirits up. And then there's also the populist movement, which was an agrarian movement of farmers in the late 1800s who began to realize that America was kind of set up to help the rich and the corporate people and not so much the regular folks, no matter how hard they worked. Then you've got people like Francis Bellamy, the author of the Pledge of Allegiance, who was a socialist and a minister of the social gospel that believed that people should help people in need, and so should the government. And then you have probably the most famous socialist in American history, Eugene Debs. He called for a society based on equality, cooperation, and workers' power. His experiences in the labor movement convinced him that the system was rigged in favor of the rich and against working people. So he founded the Socialist Party and ran for president on the socialist ticket 5 times. The New York Times called him a lawbreaker at large and an enemy of the human race, and President Wilson called him a traitor to his country. But he helped lead a movement of working people who struggled to share in America's vast wealth. He rejected racism, and he refused to speak to segregated crowds. He went to jail for speaking out against World War I, but even in prison, he managed to win almost 1 million votes for president. Then there's some of the intellectuals in American history, like Professor John Dewey, who sought not only to forge a persuasive argument for his conviction that democracy is freedom, but also to realize his democratic ideals through political activism. A modern philosopher and teacher, known for many important thoughts and works, and his participation in both radical politics in the 30s and 40s. This gentleman here you probably recognize. This is Theodore Roosevelt. He was a president, and throughout his life, he grew and learned about many things. And he figured that the only way out of the dilemma that America found itself in of greed, class conflict, and exploitation was for a democratic government to insist that workers get pensions, job security, insurance against disease, accident, old age. He called for labor to be represented on corporate boards and for the government to regulate migrant labor under a federal bureau. He wanted to give uncultivated land to reward veterans of World War I. And he founded what was eventually called the Bull Moose Party, and he supported the federal suffrage amendment of people like this woman here, Alice Paul, who was a leader in the suffrage movement and a leader in many left-wing things that happened in the 20th century. Then there's also people like lawyer Clarence Darrow, who was one of the most famous lawyers of his time and represented a lot of folks who were downtrodden and needed help against forces that they could not defend themselves against. He defended union leaders and working class people who spoke out against corporate greed and poverty. Then you have people like Jane Addams, who in 1919 was labeled by the FBI as the most dangerous woman in America. She was the founder of Hull House, and she came from a wealthy family but wanted to help poor. Hull House was located in a poor neighborhood with many immigrants. They gave classes and lectures and educated people. They took care of people's children while they were working, and eventually she became so revered that in the 1930s she became the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Now this big fella is Big Bill Haywood. Big Bill Haywood was an important leader in the union movement. And he once said, for every dollar the boss has and didn't work for, one of us worked for a dollar and didn't get it. And he helped to form the Socialist Party with Eugene Debs. Then there's people like tough guy and writer Jack London, who was also a socialist, and spoke up for the rights of regular folk against the corporate state and fascist-type policies. And then you get people like Bob La Follette, who was a very important senator back at the turn of the century, and he was a believer in that you had to fight for the rights of the common people as well. And he said, let no man think that we can deny civil liberty to others and retain it for ourselves. And as a governor and a senator, he had a very forward-thinking agenda that believed in keeping power diffused and making self-government work. A lot like this guy. This guy was Arthur Upton Sinclair. And he managed to scare the daylights out of mainstream politicians when he converted from the Socialist Party to the Democratic Party and almost won election in California during the Great Depression, promising to give unused land and industry to unemployed workers. This here is General Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine in history at the time of his retirement, who wrote a book called War is a Racket, because he believed that he had been a gangster for capitalism during his service in the Marines and had been part of an agenda that was pushed to appease big business interests, not to help the country, really. And then there's people like Charlie Chaplin, whose movies, speaking out for the regular guy and for common folks, got him actually evicted from the United States, so he couldn't return for a number of years. Then there's people like Senator George Norris, who founded the Tennessee Valley Authority, which created economic development and electricity and lowered prices for people on the Tennessee Valley River. He also supported unions and created the Rural Electric Administration, which loaned co-ops funds to bring power to 300,000 rural homes in the Great Depression. Then there are artists like that guy, Thomas Hart Benton, and this guy, Norman Rockwell. And they were artists who were interested in, the lives of common folks and things like that. So Norman Rockwell, he painted the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. This one here is Murder in Mississippi, about civil rights activists that were murdered. And this is about when they desegregated the schools. And this is about how you should do unto others as others do to you. So Norman Rockwell was also a big left-wing believer. This woman here is Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day founded the Catholic Workers Society in the 1930s, and their job was to help out poor people, and she also was marched for a lot of left-wing causes. Then you've got cowboy, philosopher, humorist, writer, and roping and riding champion Will Rogers, who once said, "The money was all appropriated for the top in the hopes that it would trickle down to the needy. But Herbert Hoover didn't know that money trickled up. Give it to the people at the bottom, and the people at the top will have it before night, but it will at least have passed through the poor guy's hands." This guy here is Senator Robert Wagner. There wasn't any important left-wing legislation that was passed during the 30s and 40s that he was not involved with. Low-income housing, minimum wage, right for labor to organize, and all kinds of things. Then there's a lot of writers that believed in left-wing causes. Tough guys like Ernest Hemingway there, and John Steinbeck here, and William Faulkner right there. And then there's groups of people also in the Great Depression, like the Bonus Army. These were World War I veterans who, along with their families, tens of thousands of them, marched to Washington to ask the country to help them out during the Great Depression when things were tough for them. And so that was a very important movement in the 1930s. A lot of people don't even know about. And it was a mixed movement of whites and black soldiers together. This is Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the first lady in the 30s and the 40s, and she called for equal rights for women, equal rights for blacks, and a lot of important progressive movements, and really influenced and pushed her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the most probably left-wing president we ever had, and passed a lot of things like minimum wage, Social Security, the right to unionize and things like that, and was very popular, got elected 4 times doing it. Then there's really smart immigrants to the United States. This United States immigrant citizen Albert Einstein, who was a super, super smart fella, and he believed that we needed to have world government like the United Nations. He was a pacifist, and Einstein was also a socialist. Then you also have people like Frances Perkins here, who was the first woman cabinet secretary in Washington. She was the Secretary of Labor. And unlike a lot of women at the time, after getting married, she kept her birth name. And she said that the life of men and women is so cheap and property is so sacred in America, and that's got to stop. And then you got people like Helen Keller. And she supported the women's right to vote, opposed World War I, supported the labor movement, and became a socialist herself. And she joined the Industrial Workers of the World and helped founded the ACLU. Then there's people like Henry Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture from 33 to 40, and served as Vice President of the United States under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a Republican with very progressive views, and his defense of FDR's New Deal made him many enemies, including some in the Democratic Party, who in 1944 pushed him out so he couldn't be the VP and stuck in Harry Truman instead. Then there's also people like Janora Dollinger, and she was involved in the labor movement as well, especially in the 30s, and involved in a lot of left-wing movements. And her Women's Auxiliary Council supported these next guys who were auto workers who got together and demanded to be unionized and demanded rights. And one of the smart things they did, which ended up becoming illegal, but it really worked for them and it helped them get rights, were sit-down strikes where they occupied the factories. And then you got people like this fellow here, and this is Senator Gerald Nye, who was very much against militarism and war profiteering. And his Nye committee proved that World War I was a lot about just making profits for them. And then you got tough guy actors like Henry Fonda here and Humphrey Bogart, and they were also lifelong left-wing fellas. And then you have people like the little flower here, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, who was also a senator and mayor of New York City and Republican, and hey, he had a lot of progressive policies. And then you have Jack Kirby, Army Scout, decorated Army Scout, combat veteran, and creator of Captain America, who was a left-winger all his life and opposed the Vietnam War. Then another World War II veteran, combat pilot, Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek, who the values that he learned when he was a young man, he realized meant that he had to support many of the movements of the 60s, and he was against the Vietnam War as well. And then you have people like Theodore Geisel, also known as Dr. Seuss, who he was a cartoonist for PM Magazine, which was a left-wing magazine, and then he wrote all kinds of progressive books for children, like the Butter Battle book and the Lorax, and all them other books that you're all familiar with growing up with. And then you got decorated combat pilot George McGovern, who ended up being a senator and ran for president and was one of the most progressive candidates that they ever had, and was also one of the biggest friends of organized labor at the time, although they were against him because he let all those hippies into the party in the early 70s. Then you also have people like Pete Seeger, who really loved to make sure that people were aware of the heritage of old-timey American music, but also stood up for a lot of important left-wing causes. People like Rachel Carson, who wrote a book called Silent Spring, which was talked about how corporate America was poisoning the land and the air that we live in. And then, of course, you got this next fella who, if you read his story and the stories he told, was definitely a left-winger. He did stuff like had problem with greedy people and threw them out of the temple and things like that. So you see, your heritage is left-wing too.